What's up, you guys, and welcome back to my channel. I just want to say a huge thank you to Hunt a Killer for sponsoring today's video. I spoke about them a couple of weeks ago, and I'm actually about to open the second box tonight, and I'm so dang excited. A lot of you guys were really excited to try out Hunt a Killer as well. It is a murder mystery subscription box. Yes, I know, you heard me right. It made me so excited when I found out about this as well. It comes straight to your door monthly, and it is hands down one of the most entertaining and perfectly made for me games I've ever experienced before. Hunt a Killer comes out in seasons, and each season lasts 6 months. So you get 6 different boxes, 1 box a month, that all revolves around one specific crime. The boxes are filled with the most crazy realistic objects, you guys. There's piles and piles of documents, evidence, audio recordings, case files. You are given the task of solving the murder each season. This season in particular, Julie Adler unearths the remains of a famous actress from the 1930s in her family's theater, and something that was thought to be just a disappearance, or she possibly just ran away, becomes a homicide. You have to examine all of the evidence that you are sent, you have to eliminate suspects, you have to find the murder weapon, and I'm telling you right now, it is not a walk in the park. I've already had to do math, I've already had to do all sorts of things, and it's really awesome as well because some of the information can link to real life events that happened in that time period, so you might have to do some history research. Each box adds more information and just switches things up, keeps everything a challenge, and builds on the previous box. So sometimes when you think you figured it out, your next box throws something in and you are absolutely wrong. Hunt a Killer is the perfect subscription box for those of you that A, love true crime, and B, you love games and solving puzzles and figuring things out. This is awesome to do for a date night in. It's also something that I've done by myself and just kind of locked myself in my office at night, cleared off my entire table, set everything out, and just gone at it for hours. And then probably my favorite thing about Hunt a Killer is the fact that proceeds from every single box go straight to the Cold Case Foundation. That's a huge deal, you guys. They are giving back in whatever way that they can, which I thought was pretty awesome. And I mentioned this last time, but John Douglas is the chairman of the board for the Cold Case Foundation, and I love Mindhunter. I love criminal profiling, so this is just overall my jam, and I think that you guys would really enjoy it too. Right now, just for my subscribers, you guys can go to huntakiller.com/Danelle Hallan and use code Hallan for a 20% discount off of your first box. So again, make sure to use code Hallan for 20% off your first box. It shows support to my channel, it shows support to the Cold Case Foundation, and it's a whole heck of a lot of fun. Thank you again to Hunt a Killer for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget, all the information will also be listed down in the description box below, and let's jump into today's case. So today I'm going to be speaking about the unsolved, technically there's a lot of debate about this, murder of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine. Now, this is a MMIWG case, missing murdered Indigenous women, technically, and children of Canada. I try to cover these as frequently as I can. Unfortunately, kind of a part of this is the fact that there's not a lot of information for these cases. So when I find a case where there is a lot of information, I can build a decent sized video to kind of help you guys understand and highlight the problems. I go for it, and this is definitely one of those. Now, I will say, before watching this, something I highly suggest you watch, and I say this every MMIW video, is my Tamra Keepness video. I kind of started that video with a brief history of the Indigenous population in Canada, things that they went through. I go a lot into the systemic issues and residential schooling and how that's trickled down. So while I will briefly mention those things in this video, to kind of get more of the history, maybe go to Tamra Keepness video first. But to give you a brief rundown, I guess you could say, in Canada, the last statistics that I have seen, Aboriginal women make up only 3% of the population, but also somehow make up 10% of all female homicides in Canada. That's a huge problem. If you are only 3% of the population and you are taking up that much percentage of homicides, there's something very wrong here. And unfortunately, the more time passes, and especially as of lately, I know from 2018 till now, there's been an increase in the male population, young male population, that's struggling with the same exact issue. So this is why it's so important to speak about this topic. So now let's just get on into what happened to Tina. Everything that happened in her life, quite literally from start to finish, is heartbreaking. And that is the pattern with a lot of the Indigenous population in Canada. She was only 15 years old when someone took her life, and nobody stepped in to help her, despite years and years of the possibility to do so. Tina was born into chaos right off the bat. She was born January 1st, 1999 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Her mom was only 17 years old at the time. She was from the Bloodvein First Nation, and she was actually in the care of the government when Tina was born. So her mom still wasn't even an adult yet. Tina's father, Eugene, was over 10 years older than Valentina. He was 28 years old, and he was from the Sag King First Nation. And this was not Eugene and Valentina's first child. Tina was actually their second child. So keep in mind that Valentina was only 17 years old, and she's having her second kid while still in the hands of the government. And unfortunately, their first child had been taken away from them because both Valentina and Eugene struggled from a lot of addiction problems. And this, again, is just a huge common factor in the Indigenous population. Unfortunately, when people around this age at this time, 17 years old, 28 years old, their parents were part of the residential schooling in a really, really difficult time in Canada where children were just taken from their parents, forcibly taken from the Indigenous community in an attempt to assimilate them. And again, I go way deeper into this in my Tamara Keepness video, but in reality, that's not at all what was happening with these children. Some of them were taken from their parents without permission, basically, and sent to other countries to be adopted. Some of them were put into residential schooling where they were physically and sexually abused. Again, it was to assimilate them, but in reality, they were never taught how to speak proper English, write proper English, read, nothing, like no language period they had any good grasp on. So when these schools were closed or when these people were thrown out into the world, they didn't have a lot of options. They weren't able to do a lot. So they took really bad jobs and they led really bad lifestyles. They fell into drugs, fell into all sorts of addictions. They fell into sex work. They would get pregnant. They were never loved as a child because they were being forced to be in these residential schools. So they had no clue how to parent themselves. And then their children, which is what we're looking at now, they weren't parented because their parents couldn't parent. This is so, I know this sounds crazy, but it's just how it works. So they were then in turn not able to properly parent their children, and they fell into the same habits. Just this domino effect. And I could honestly sit here and talk about this for hours because it's heartbreaking and there's just so much proof and evidence of the systemic problems and just how badly these residential schools failed and the government failed these people. But I'll stop there because now I'm starting to get like heated. But the point of it is that Valentina and Eugene both had issues because of this. I'm pretty sure Eugene's father, or at least his grandfather, was in residential schooling and trickle effect affected him, and the same thing with Valentina. So they had no clue how to parent, but they were trying very hard. Right before Tina was born, they decided to get clean. They wanted to be able to parent her properly. They wanted to get their first child back, their daughter, and they did. They did a pretty good job. She gave birth to Tina, but unfortunately, pretty soon after, they both fell into addiction again. Now, unfortunately, by 2002, Eugene and Valentina decided to separate, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Eugene had managed to pull himself out of addiction yet again. He was able to take care of Tina and their other daughter. I don't believe either one of their children had any contact with Valentina after this. I know she ended up getting in a relationship with another man, and she did eventually go on to have 7 children in total, but she was living in Winnipeg. She was still in sex work. She was still struggling with addiction, and it just was not a good situation. Tina loved her father. They were living a decent life, but by 2004, he ended up being diagnosed with cancer. She was only, I think, 5 years old at the time, and I don't know if this had anything to do with it or if it was just the way things were going to go regardless, but Eugene ended up falling back into addiction, and Tina and her sister were taken away from him, and they were placed with their great aunt and uncle, Thelma and Joseph. He lived with them for almost 10 years in Powerview Pine Falls, and it was still a tricky situation. she was a happy kid. She really was. All the pictures of her that they had up, she was smiling. She was such a sweet young girl. She loved other kids. She especially loved babies. She loved to take care of them. She also loved school, but unfortunately, she struggled a lot with it. She struggled with writing. She struggled with reading. From the beginning of her report cards, all of her teachers said, you know, she showed no improvement at all. There probably should be something done. Maybe she needs to just focus more. Maybe something else is going on. And it was thought, I believe, by first grade that she could have been suffering from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And her aunt tried repeatedly to get her tested and have different things done to figure this out. But for some reason, these services were just never given to her, despite the fact that at this point, she is technically in a foster situation. It is her family, but it is a foster situation. Those supportive services that are supposed to come into play and help, they just never did. And this is just the start of a string of all the times when this would happen, when she would need help and no help was given. But she still went to school. She still remained in contact with her father, but her world flipped upside down in 2011. She was 12 at this point, and at this time, her father had still been struggling with cancer. He was very, very sick, but that ended up ultimately not even being what took his life. He got into an argument with two men, and they ended up beating him to death. And this was traumatizing for Tina. She was still very, very close to him, and it destroyed her. She got a tattoo on her back to honor him. It was angel wings and his name, plus his birth date and date of death. But this started a pretty rapid downhill spiral when it came to Tina. She was depressed. Keep in mind, she's 12 years old at this point. She just lost her father. You know, her childhood hasn't been necessarily the easiest. And between the years of 12 and 14, after losing her father, she began to struggle in school even more than she had previously. She started to skip class. She didn't do any of her work. She just didn't really care at all. She became very violent towards others, including her own family. She started to experiment with drugs and alcohol. And again, the age is between 12 and 14 years old. She also became a victim of sexual exploitation. She would run away, and these men would come and they'd pick her up. They would come and get her from her home or come and get her from wherever, and they would take her away for a few days, and there's absolutely no telling what happened. It was a bad situation, and her family tried very, very hard to help her, but it was very clear that her grieving from losing her father was kind of what pushed her into this behavior a lot. And her family reached out to victim services again, and they were like, look, this is obviously an issue. She needs help. And I believe at this point she was still meeting with CFS workers because she was still technically in a foster situation. And she was meeting with them, and they did tons of assessments on her, and they even agreed that something needed to be done. She needed some sort of counseling. She needed some sort of intervention because she was taking a horrible path because she had no clue at all how to cope with what was happening in her life. Meanwhile, she's using drugs, she's meeting with older men, and I know a few times her family went and reported these older men. It was child grooming, so her family would go to the RCMP, be like, look, she's speaking to these men online, but RCMP never did a single thing. RCMP never stepped in to help her. CFS never fully stepped in to help her, so she just kept living this lifestyle and no one could stop it. Desperate attempts kept being made to victim services for some sort of aid, and they either said there was no availability, or if there was availability, it was almost like impossible to get her placed anywhere. Her problems were essentially ignored. That's exactly what was happening. The time she got to 14 and 15, she was still struggling, and I mean, I'm talking like a rapid downhill fall. She began to mention her mother. She wanted to kind of rekindle the relationship with her. I don't believe she even knew her at this point, and this was understandable because she lost her father. It's natural for her to then gravitate towards her mother because you don't want to lose that bond as well. But everyone knew her mother's lifestyle and how moldable Tina would be at this age and how much worse the situation could get if she were with her mother, if she did create this relationship. But it was very clear nothing was stopping Tina. She continued to run away to try to get to her mom and do all sorts of things. So her family ended up giving her around $50 and a phone card on July 1st, 2014 to head to Winnipeg to meet with her mom. And this ended up being the last time any of her family saw her other than her mom. Tina had a boyfriend at the time that lived in a different location, and he was kind of closely monitoring what Tina was doing while she was with her mom, and he was so alarmed by her behavior and her mom's behavior that he ended up getting in contact with her family back at home. Tina was apparently using crack with her mom on a regular basis. Like, that was their family bonding time, was doing crack together. Also, according to Tina's boyfriend, she was just continuously sexually exploited. I know that her mom was in sex work. I don't know if she was forced to do things like that or if it was maybe her mom's boyfriend. I have absolutely no idea, but this was alarming and terrifying, and despite people begging Tina to come home, she just didn't want to. The next few weeks after this are just a blur, and no one really knows for sure what exactly Tina was doing, but the things that we do know are absolutely horrifying, and the lack of actions taken to help her is a huge, huge issue, and it's going to shock the hell out of all of you, and I'm just saying that right now. Within the next few weeks, Tina was reported missing multiple times, you guys, because not only was her family reporting her missing, because she was technically under the care of the government still, they had to report her missing as well when they could not contact her. Basically, what she was doing, from what we know, was bouncing around from shelter to her parents' house, her mom's house, back and forth. She would disappear from the government care for a while, and then she'd come back a few days later and show up at a shelter like a couple pounds down, covered in more bruises, looking absolutely terrible. She was sending pictures to her sister from her phone during this time. She was showing pictures of bruises all over her body. She was claiming that it was her mother's new boyfriend that was beating the absolute crap out of her. She sent pictures of herself taking drugs on multiple different occasions. It was a scary situation. On July 17th and 18th, things got really, really bad. At this point, she'd been there for about half a month, and she ended up being picked up by a CFS worker on the 17th. I've seen a few different versions of the story. One is that she was just very intoxicated and found that way, so someone called for help. I've seen another version where she was being dragged by a man down the street and she was screaming for help. Either way, she was found, and she was wildly intoxicated, you guys. She said that she drank over a dozen beers. I think she drank a whole bunch of liquor on top of that. She said that she had been taking drugs. So the CFS worker ended up taking her to a downtown hotel to check her in because it was the only emergency housing that they had. I don't even know if she was being monitored while she was there. I don't know if they just got her a room and put her in it and hoped she would stay. But by the following day, she was released anyway. So it wasn't even like she was in there for an extended period of time anyway. She had nowhere to go. There was no further help. It's like they got her when she was drugged up and drunk, and then they're like, all right, sober up here, and then they just released her. And I'm going to remind you, again, a 15-year-old girl. She was reported missing again on July 31st, and this time she ended up being found in the car of an older man. I think this car was pulled over, and she lied about who she was a couple of times. This man was much older than she was, didn't have his license, and they finally ended up figuring out who she was. They found out that she was missing, but again, instead of doing anything to actually benefit this young girl, they just dropped her off at a shelter. I don't know if authorities stopped to see if she would actually go in and stay or what exactly, but she didn't. She was literally dropped off, I believe, and just turned around and left yet again. But maybe if authorities knew what was going to happen to her in just a few hours, they may have taken things a bit more seriously. But even that, to me, is just wishful thinking. A few hours later, Tina was found unconscious in an alleyway, partially dressed. This alley in particular was known for sexual exploitation. It was by the University of Winnipeg, and no one could get this girl to come to. Paramedics were sent in. She was alive, but she was not responsive, so they took her into the hospital, and obviously a CFS worker again showed up to kind of figure out what was going on. You guys, this 15-year-old young girl tested positive for marijuana, amphetamines, cocaine. The list goes on and on and on. They wanted to check for signs of sexual assault given the way that her body was found, but she claimed there was no sexual assault. She refused to be checked. So once she was stable, they had no choice really but to release her, I guess. And while being driven to, you guessed it, another hotel in downtown Winnipeg, she started to tell her CFS worker all these alarming stories. She again was talking all about the drugs she was taking, all about the drinking she was doing, and she started bringing up this 50-year-old man who she said was known for using meth that was supposed to buy her a bicycle. I mean, just terrifying stories, you guys. And the CFS worker just dropped her off at this hotel after hearing that. I know she was only there for a couple of hours. They did try to offer her food, but nobody stopped her from leaving. So I think around 5:30 that day, she walked out of the hotel. This is the last time anyone saw her. Since Tina never returned to the hotel after this, never got in contact with the CFS worker, she was again reported missing. And to me, this is frustrating because authorities didn't do anything for a couple of days. The most they did was send out a bolo. And why this is frustrating to me is because I feel like they developed this very accepting attitude towards her going missing. It should not have been normal for her to go missing to begin with. She's 15 years old. It should not have been normal for her to be then picked up and just left on the side of the street after being missing once she's found. And I feel like it got to the point where they're like, oh, well, she's been missing so many times, like she'll show up before. This shouldn't be a pattern to begin with. Like there should have been intervention way in the beginning to where this pattern was never seen as something that's acceptable or normal or anything, to the point where they only send out a bolo and just sit back and hope she shows up again. It wasn't until the following week that authorities finally decided to start doing a little bit more in her case. They first attempted to call around to her family, who had not heard from her in days. They tried to get in contact with her mom, who she had been with. Her mom claimed that she hadn't spoken to her. The last time anyone had even had any communication with her was, I believe, when she texted her sister days prior. She texted her and said, "Tell Mama and Papa I love them and I miss them, but I'm not ready to go home." After this, her phone use completely stopped. I don't believe any physical search efforts were even made. I think it was still bare minimum of just calling around, checking the different shelters, hoping she showed up. But on August 17th, something unexpected was found. Authorities were searching a part of the Red River that ran through Manitoba, and it was looking not for her, but for another man that had gone missing. And downstream, a father and a son were fishing at one of the docks. They saw something floating in the water, and although they were not a part of this search, they kind of knew what was going on, so they called authorities, and because authorities were already there looking for this man, they thought, you know, this could be him, let's go and check this out. They ended up finding a body, but a very, very small and frail one. The body had been weighed down with rocks and wrapped in a plastic bag, and then wrapped again in a brown and green comforter, and then wrapped again in a brown and green duvet. The body was so decomposed that the face was unrecognizable, so this body had at least been in the water for a couple of days. It was taken for a forensic examination and an autopsy. There were no broken bones. They could not find cause of death. It took hours for them to even find out that this was a female and not a male, so it was not the person they were looking for. And there were no severe injuries. There was no sign of sexual assault. They couldn't even find hard drugs in the system of this person. It was just marijuana. And this was frustrating because this was obviously a homicide. Someone's not going to wrap wrap themselves up, weigh themselves down, and then throw themselves in a river. This was something that someone had done to them, but because this person had been in the water for so long, this body had been in the water, there was no DNA on any of the rocks, the plastic, the blanket, the body. There was absolutely nothing. And the decomposition kind of took away the ability to find out the cause of death unless there was something very traumatic done, like maybe broken bones or a stab wound or a gunshot, but there didn't appear to be any of that. And then finally, they ended up being able to figure out who this was by a tattoo on the back of this body. And you already know at this point, they had discovered the remains of Tina Fontaine. This 15-year-old girl, you guys, was found, I'm trying not to cry, wrapped in plastic and a duvet weighed down with rocks. 15 years old, she'd been thrown in the damn river, and there was nothing at all, nothing, not a single thing left behind to explain how this happened, who did it. There was no crime scene. There's no telling how far her body had gone, where this may have occurred, and because she went missing so many times and no one managed to keep tabs on her, there wasn't even any telling what day this happened to her. Because Tina was still, again, I've said this a million times in this video, under the care of the government, CFS immediately had to review her death because that is someone they were supposed to be managing, someone they were supposed to be protecting and taking care of, and she died on their watch. They sent a plea to the public and tips started coming in. Most seemed plausible. There were a few different ideas. There were men overheard speaking about killing her. Those men were looked into. It was ruled out. There were just a handful of other things that seemed possible. They were looked into. It was just ruled out. And they decided to speak to those close to her to figure out if she was having problems with anyone or what exactly was going on. And they spoke to her boyfriend and found a possible answer. So her boyfriend had come to visit her a handful of times while she was in Winnipeg. He came sometime, he said, in the middle of July, and while he was with her, they ended up meeting a man on a bike. This man referred to himself as Sebastian, and he gave both Tina and her boyfriend drugs and even showed them a house. And I think this was just like a house that they could go to whenever they wanted to get the drugs or use the drugs and have a place to stay. I'm not 100% sure, but her boyfriend said that once he left and went back home, he knew for a fact that Tina was still meeting with Sebastian, still going to this house, still using these drugs, and this was, I guess, something alarming to him. Authorities were able to connect a few dots in his story, and they were able to find out that Tina was last with this man last at this house on the 6th of August. So only a few days before she finally went missing. She was last seen, I believe, on the 8th. The missing report was on the 9th. So this was very, very close. They wondered if maybe something happened or if maybe she went back to this house. They ended up being able to find a few people who would frequent this house, and this gave them witness statements that did in fact place Sebastian, this mysterious man, with Tina on almost a regular basis. And apparently, according to these same people, Sebastian and Tina were at the house on the 6th and they got into an argument. Apparently, Tina was accusing Sebastian of selling her bike for drugs. And the reason this kind of raised a red flag with authorities and CFS workers is because the last time, I believe on the 8th, when she was taken to the hotel after being released from the hospital, she had told her CFS worker about Sebastian. Apparently, after the argument between Tina and Sebastian, she left and called the cops on him. She claimed to know that he had stolen a truck earlier that day. She knew exactly where the truck was being stored. She was basically ratting him out because she was mad at him. Authorities on the phone said, you just need to call the police directly. Like, don't call the emergency line, call police directly. And that was that. And I have no idea if she did or not, but at least this phone call was able to confirm that she did get in an argument with Sebastian, likely, and it kind of just linked him more to whatever may have happened to her. The authorities really wanted to find this Sebastian character, and through a little bit of digging, they were able to find out that Sebastian was not what this person's real name was. It was actually 51-year-old Raymond Cormier, and he was a slimy character. He was known, again, for meth. He was known for stealing. He just kind of wandered his way around the community and was just not a great character. Authorities wanted to track him down for obvious reasons. He could have been mad about the argument that he got into with Tina the night of August 6th, just days before she went missing and was then killed, or maybe he found out that she ratted him out and was angry about it and wanted to get revenge on her. But he was proving incredibly difficult to find. They knew about this truck that he had stolen. They had a description of it. They couldn't find the truck. They decided to check the surveillance at the hotel to see if maybe he had come to pick her up or if they could connect the dots that way. And sure enough, the day that Tina disappeared, a truck matching that description pulled into the hotel. And it was a very sketchy situation. The truck pulled in, turned all the lights off, and the driver didn't get out. The car didn't move for 30 minutes. Now, within this 30 minutes, I believe there was like some movement in the car. There was like a flashlight that might have gone off a few times. Looked like it was looking for something. And then 30 minutes after the car had been sitting there, there was movement around the passenger side. And as soon as this happened, the car took off. Like, no regard for anything around it. It went over a median, like over the sidewalk, just like flipped around and sped off. This person didn't even go out a normal exit. So clearly there's some sort of emergency here or someone's feeling some type of way because they just sped off. Unfortunately, because everything was so dark, it wasn't like they could for sure say that this was Raymond. And even though there was movement on the passenger side, they couldn't for sure say that maybe Tina got into the car or something. There's no telling, but it was definitely very, very suspicious. It took 1 month for authorities to finally find the truck. It was found on, I believe, Portage Road or Portage Avenue, and they immediately took it in for forensic testing. They wanted to see if there was any sign of Tina's DNA, any sign of a murder, like blood, anything. They checked this truck top to bottom and they weren't able to find a single thing. There was not a stitch of evidence within this truck. And that was very, very frustrating because they thought they were kind of steps closer to figuring out what happened and hopefully having evidence to charge Raymond with something because he was, at this point in time, the only person of interest that they had. It took even longer for authorities to finally find Raymond, and it also took a tip from an inmate to even do it to begin with. An inmate came forward and said that he witnessed a lot of stuff happen between Raymond and Tina, that Raymond had like a sexual attraction to Tina. He would talk about her all the time. He just had this huge fascination with her, and this inmate was able to also give an address where Raymond might be. So authorities went to this location to try to find him, and sure enough, he was there. But guess what he did? The most suspicious thing you can possibly do. He ran, and he apparently screamed something while running away along the lines of like, "You're not gonna get me" for something. He did end up being captured, and he was brought in for questioning, and he actually didn't deny very much. He admitted that he got into an argument with Tina. He admitted that they did drugs. He admitted all sorts of things, but he said he never did anything to her, that he never harmed her. He kept saying, "I didn't hurt that little girl." And he even was able to offer up this kind of other theory about what may have happened. He said that a local biker gang may have killed Tina because she owed them money. I guess she owed them like $250 or something from buying coke from them, and she never paid it back, so they killed her. Now, first of all, that's like a very small amount of money to kill someone over if you are seriously dealing drugs, just saying. So that kind of made it unbelievable, and he also had no other evidence to give them to back this. He kind of just spewed it out. So I don't know if authorities ever looked into that possibility or if they immediately dismissed it, but they ended up having no choice but to let Raymond go because they had nothing. They had no physical evidence. They had no DNA linking him to her. When it came to her body after death, there was nothing in the truck that he was in. They had nothing but these random witness testimonies. But they were determined to get Raymond for the murder of Tina Fontaine. They decided to perform a sting operation on him, and I can't find a lot of details about this, which is kind of frustrating for me because I want to know exactly how they went about this, but one way or another, they ended up getting recording equipment into his apartment, and at one point in time, I think he was with a woman in his apartment, and he said something that sounded a lot like a confession. He said, and I quote, And the words were kind of jumbled, so it's not like full sentences, and I only have a few of them. But he said something along the lines of, "It was right on the shore, so I threw her in." The person he was with then kind of asked him, "What the heck are you talking about?" And his response was, "I did Tina." Authorities said this was their smoking gun, and they went and grabbed Raymond. They figured that they could use this against him to really push him into confessing, giving a real confession to them, but that is not at all how it went. Raymond was pissed. He was telling authorities that they were just trying to find someone to blame this on because they didn't do their job as a government and protecting her. I mean, he lost his marbles. He spoke to a few different news outlets about this, but authorities didn't care. Even though they didn't have a confession like they hoped to get from him, they arrested and charged Raymond anyways, completely on this circumstantial evidence. While waiting for the trial, there was a huge public outroar, obviously. Pressure was being put on CFS to change their response when it came to missing children and youth, and there was this huge thing put out with 5 specific points that many asked to be changed, and I'm about to go through those right now. So the first one was they wanted K through 12 absences to be monitored more closely because these kids are just skipping school, like Tina, for instance, and while it was known they weren't going to school, kind of nothing more was done. It's like they knew it, but they didn't act on it. They also wanted to limit out-of-school suspensions and expulsions because the goal was to keep these kids in school, keep them accounted for so that they didn't become victims like Tina did. They didn't end up in the life of drugs and alcohol and sexual exploitation. They were in a safe environment instead. The second point was they wanted a plan put in place to address the youth mental health and addiction crisis that was very clearly going on. She started using drugs at 12, possibly earlier. And how many people knew about it and just didn't really do anything for her? 3, they asked for victim support services for children to develop and actually monitor their services because, as I just stated in the previous point, these services were just not given. And as you saw multiple times in Tina's situation, her family went to victim services and was like, "Look, help her, like do something please." And they always said, "Oh, that service isn't actually available," or "Oh yeah, we have that service, but we can't really give it to you right now." And they weren't monitoring that these struggling children and young adults were actually being provided the help that they needed. Point number 4, they asked the ministers of health and social policy to analyze issues with sexually exploited children as well as drug endangered children to figure out the best way to create treatment facilities because, again, as you can see in Tina's story, when she would be picked up drugged and drunk, only one time that we know of was she actually taken to the hospital. The other time that she was picked up drunk after she drank over a dozen beers and liquor, she was just taken to a hotel. We don't even know if anyone was monitoring her. And this is so true for other individuals in this situation. There was no great treatment facility for them. There was nowhere they could go really that was safe and secure where they were being monitored, their health was being monitored, their, drug and alcohol addictions were being taken seriously. They were just kind of left to sober up. And I say that and even just thinking about it, I automatically think of when adults are found drunk and taken to jail for the night to sober up. But this is children. She was 15 years old. You shouldn't just take a 15-year-old to a hotel to sober up. Even saying that sounds insane to me. And the last point number 5, they asked for new protocol to be put in place for the missing youth and sexually exploited because clearly none of the missing were taken seriously. They were found after being reported missing, basically handed off to their CFS worker, or the CFS worker was just notified they were found, and then they were just dumped off in front of a shelter or a hotel, and that's it. Only for them to then turn around, walk away again, and again be reported missing. The Indigenous community had enough. Tina had been in contact with multiple law enforcement officers and agencies, CFS workers, health workers, people all across the board, volunteers at the different shelters that she was at. They all knew very well that she was on drugs, that she was using alcohol, that she was being sexually exploited. They all saw her bruises. They all saw her lose weight. She weighed over 100 pounds going to Winnipeg in the beginning of July. When her body was found in August, early August, she lost 30 pounds, you guys. She was only 70 something pounds when she was found. And these people watched her. They just watched her wither away. The following June, CFS announced that they would no longer place children in random hotels, which was a huge deal, and more things just kept happening to hopefully benefit the community. A group called Drag the Red started. They were made up of volunteers, and basically what they would do is anytime there was a missing person or a homicide, they would go and search the river, because this was a very common place for people to be thrown or evidence to be thrown. And so that's what they would look for. They would look for bodies. They would look for evidence along the bottom. The Bear Clan Patrol was also created. And I even think I spoke about this in, I don't think it was the Tamara Keepness video, but I know I'm pretty sure I spoke about this in one of my MMIW videos. But they basically were created to promote safety and crime prevention in the city. If I'm not mistaken, they kind of go around and check on the women and check on the young men and all the children and everyone who's out there. The temporary youth shelter that Tina frequented a lot within her month of being in Winnipeg ended up changing their name to Tina's Safe Haven. And after being granted federal funding, they actually turned into a 24/7 drop-in center for at-risk youth. I believe they were only open on weekends, and I think this is something that was a big problem, is that a lot of these youth centers, they were only open weekends, so during the week, these children were just on the streets. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to sleep, nowhere safe. So this was a huge deal that this became a 24/7 center. And I know that to this day, I think they have 50 beds. Usually there's not one open. They are always constantly rotating people in and out, and it's scary because these young children and young adults range from ages 13 to 24. A short-term crisis prevention program was also put into place, and it was staffed by the Indigenous community. It basically was there to help the youth that were very specifically at risk of sexual exploitation. Many steps were made, but more still needed to be made, and this was huge though. This was very beneficial, and I hope things continue to go this way, but all it does is make me think as well of all of the times where stuff like this would have been beneficial and possibly saved so many lives. Then the trial came. It was January 2018. Raymond was finally on trial for the murder of Tina, and as I'm sure you're expecting, with no forensic evidence, no direct confession, only a sting recording that wasn't even specific, and a handful of witnesses, it was no surprise that by February, literally a month later, Raymond was found not guilty of Tina's murder. And this created a very interesting situation. There were a lot of different responses from the community. A lot of people were not convinced that he was in fact responsible, because there was just obviously a large lack of proof of that. There were also a lot of people convinced that he was. So basically, either authorities had not actually caught the person that killed her and tried an innocent man, which means that A, the killer is running loose somewhere free, and B, they tried an innocent man, or they caught the right person that killed her and that person got away, because just not enough had been done from start to finish when it came to Tina. The second she got to Winnipeg, the second she was born, basically, it was just a disaster from the start. It seemed like she was never given a chance in life and was never going to get justice in death. But what this did was really show the community the flaws in the system. The lack of services available. It wasn't just an every once in a while thing. It wasn't just the older that she got. She was denied help from the very beginning, and when you create this pattern from the start, no wonder a lot of these individuals end up in the situation they end up in later on in life, because they're never given any chance for things to happen otherwise. By the following day, after he was announced as not being found guilty, over 1,000 people decided to march through Winnipeg to honor Tina and also to demand that more be done to protect the Indigenous community. And this really led Tina's death in particular to the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls of Canada. And this really started September 1st, I think, 2016. Is a lot. While her family does believe that there is a lot that needs to be changed, a lot of laws that need to be put into place, a lot of different services that actually need to do their job, and, everything really just needs to be refreshed in a way that makes it beneficial. They also brought up a really good point and a whole other issue that I actually don't see a lot of people speak about when it comes to this. Victims, there's a lot of attention on them, which is great. There is a lot of attention on fixing a lot of these problems, but there's almost no attention on the criminals themselves, which is very, very odd. If you look at this entire situation from start to finish, it's very easy to see all the places that Tina was failed, but how many times did you really think about all the times where she potentially was with a criminal and nothing was done to that person? How many times the people that were sexually exploiting her and preying on her and grooming her, how many times were they reported and nothing was done? You guys, she was speaking to older males online at the age of 12 to 14, and her family reported this. RCMP literally said they didn't even have evidence that this was reported. And this ended up being looked into because a lot of people started putting two and two together, and I think even the RCMP realized that maybe they messed up. Nothing was done about these men that she was talking to online. Like, I don't understand it. She was found in the car as a 15-year-old girl with an older male. She was missing. A freaking missing minor was found with an older man, and I don't even think anything was done with him in regards to her. I think maybe something was done. Maybe he was arrested for driving without a license, but like what? Like it's terrifying. This vulnerable group of people is just being preyed on, and it's absolutely sick. To this day, no one really knows what happened to Tina. I don't know if I believe Raymond is responsible or if he's not. I just feel like there's not enough information out there to sway me otherwise without a doubt. Like I said, she got no help in life and no justice in death, and it's absolutely heartbreaking, and it is a pattern that has just repeated itself over and over and over again. I challenge every single one of you to sit down and just look into the numbers of this. Go briefly read a few stories of MMIW young women and men that have gone missing, and just take it all in for a second. I always end up getting such a vast array of hateful comments on videos when I do this. There are, Indigenous individuals that comment on this very angry because their lifestyle isn't the way that I'm describing this. Keep in mind that we all walk different paths. We all live different lives, but there is a massive chunk of the population, whether you are an Indigenous person or not, and you're not struggling with this, that's good. That's a great thing. But it does not negate the fact that the reality for many Indigenous individuals is this. I know that Tina's family has even said that they know people who were in residential schooling, and those people went on to be fine and have kids that are fine, and then that goes on and on. But again, that does not negate the reality that so many are not that lucky. So many people did not ever have that happen. So just be aware going into this that this is a reality, period. Whether you want to accept it or not, or whether it's your reality or not, this is something that is going on, and spreading knowledge about it can in fact help. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Tina's story. Again, I highly recommend my Tamara Keepness video if you guys are interested in hearing more about the history in this, but also do your own research. Something needs to be done. More needs to be done. This is still a problem. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below so you can become a part of the Hallan fam so we can hopefully bring them home together, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.